Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's always a delight to come back to SGH because I'm an old boy of SGH, and barely 10 years ago, I still recognize some faces, some familiar faces, some of you who were treated by me 10 years ago. And it attests to the fact that right now you're looking so good, and it's like you just recovered from a bout of multiple myeloma. It attests to the fact that myeloma right now is seeing better and better prospects, and patients are living longer and longer. So I am standing between you and lunch, so I promise to deliver this in a very light-hearted manner so that you will get to enjoy your lunch shortly after this. So you have heard all the advances in multiple myeloma from the earlier speakers. We've indeed come a long way from the very first case of myeloma that was described in 1844, a very poor lady, Sarah Newsbury. She had no Velcade, no Zomita. As a result, she died a horrible death. That was how she looked like before her death. Her bones were all so contorted. But of course, this comes as no surprise because during those times, she was treated only with rhubarb, orange peel, leeches. All right? So in those days, median survivor of myeloma, probably you're looking at 1 or 2 years. With the World War came the discovery of chemotherapy, and for a while in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we were relying heavily on chemotherapy to treat multiple myeloma. So when there's a limit to how much the body can tolerate chemotherapy, that was when we started doing autologous stem cell transplantation. Many of you have undergone stem cell transplantation where we take out some of your stem cells, infuse very high dose chemotherapy, and then infuse your stem cells back to the system. And for some of you, another way of transplant is called allogenic transplant. This is now rarely done, only for selected cases. Common to chemotherapy and stem cell transplantation is that these drugs used for these modalities are what we call conventional cytotoxic chemotherapy. They kill all dividing cells. As a result, you get a lot of collateral damages, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and a very feared second malignancy, so second cancers many years down the road. So the discovery of the proteasome in 2000, at the turn of the century, I mean, this really is a major milestone for multiple myeloma because the proteasome was discovered, and those 3 chaps discovered proteasome won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. So proteasome essentially is the garbage bin of the cell. If I can put a lid on the garbage bin in the form of a drug called Velcade, then I can poison the cell with a lot of garbage, and this is how we could kill myeloma cells very effectively. So I'm sure all myeloma patients now know what is Velcade and had experience with receiving bortezomib or Velcade. So of course, with other drugs, what we call the immunomodulatory drugs, thalidomide and lenalidomide, suddenly we realized that, hey, we are actually converting myeloma from a terminal disease to a chronic illness akin to perhaps like hypertension or heart disease or diabetes mellitus. And of course, over the past 2-3 years, the next generation proteasome inhibitor like carfilzomib, pomalidomide, the newer drugs, ixazomib, alatuzumab, and daratumumab, which you heard earlier on from the earlier speaker, Dr. Molly. With these drugs in our armamentarium, we are secretly optimistic that with a careful and intelligent combination of these drugs, we could perhaps be looking at the cure of multiple myeloma. So right now, we target the internal signaling in the myeloma cells with drugs like lenalidomide, Velcade, and also we are able to target surface antigens of the cell in the form of immunotherapy. So daratumumab herald the era of immunotherapy for multiple myeloma. And it is indeed very pleasing that any one given time, more and more patients with myeloma are alive because of combination of drugs. Some chemotherapy, a lot of targeted drugs, and immunotherapy. However, this comes with a caveat. Although these targeted drugs do not come with the toxicity that we see with conventional chemotherapy, it comes with another form of toxicity called financial toxicity. So patients will find that the financial burden to pay for these drugs can be really, really tough. So take, for instance, right now with all these trials, all these drugs, in the Western guidelines, normally in Singapore and Asia, we follow guidelines from Western literature. I mean, what the doctor associations in America recommend, we tend to embrace that like gospel truth. However, in the Western guidelines, they advocate these very expensive drugs up front, but some of these guidelines do not show us the price tag. For instance, right now, the ideal way to start, or the optimal best way to start a patient with myeloma treatment is with VRD regimen, Velcade, Revlimid, and dexamethasone. That could set you back easily by about $15,000. And if you look at the average GDP per capita spend on healthcare in these Asian countries, you see that you're looking at a few $100, and suddenly there is a disconnect between what is being preached in the ideal world and what we really can practice in the real world. So take, for instance, a patient who is younger than 65, 70 years old. The standard treatment right now, as recommended by most guidelines, is VRD treatment as induction. You get 4 to 6 cycles, then you go for stem cell transplant, and then you go on what we call Revlimid maintenance for at least 2 years or even more. So if you look at the price tag for this treatment, which is actually standard treatment, after you have completed 2 years of Revlimid maintenance, you are already set back by $500,000 US. And mind you, myeloma is, at this point, we still cannot say that we can cure myeloma. This is just talking about the first stage of treatment of multiple myeloma. So, I mean, we must always conserve our resources for treatment of the first relapse, the second relapse, and subsequent relapses. So that's why your myeloma doctors are all working very hard, and usually we do not tell you that you have got finite resources, dump everything in the frontline setting, because we want patients to have resources and means to treat subsequent relapses. So that is very, very important. And currently, with all the new drugs that we have heard, many of these new drugs are now recommended in the frontline when the patient has relapsed or refractory disease. And these drugs are just getting more and more expensive. And some more, right now the recommendation is that with these new drugs in the relapse setting, we want these drugs to be in combination because we want synergism, and these drugs have to be given continuously. So this is a double whammy actually, especially for whoever who is funding treatment, because something like this would easily bankrupt the entire healthcare system, because myeloma is actually one of the most expensive diseases to treat. Just to give you a rough figure, in the US, myeloma constitutes about 1% of all cancers. However, the expenditure on drug costs is 17%. So it's like inflated 17 times, because myeloma, there's so much development in myeloma, so many drugs available that is good. Patients are living longer and longer, but the cost to treat myeloma is extremely exorbitant. And so if you look at what is recommended, combination chemotherapy, for treatment of a relapse, entry level, which is VRD, Velcade, Revlimid, dexamethasone. In the US, it costs about $500,000 a year to take this therapy. And this is probably the cheapest if you look at other more innovative therapies that involve carfilzomib, daratumumab, so on and so forth. So for many of us in Singapore, really, to afford something like this, you must have, unless you have a very good integrated shield plan, otherwise, the doctors are actually working very hard to help fund these treatments, and also we're always trying to get whatever subvention we could so that patients will get the best care. To pay out of pocket for these drugs, unfortunately, you have to be crazy rich Asian, because no one will be able to afford such a bill to treat multiple myeloma. The truth is that in the world, if you look at patients getting upfront VRD, or patients who are able to get all the new drugs that have been shown in the guidelines, only these countries in red, America, the Nordic countries, Germany, Japan. In Singapore, only if you have a very good integrated shield plan. Otherwise, many of us throughout the world, we do not have the luxury of getting all these drugs whenever we need them. So even for bread and butter, bortezomib and lenalidomide, right now these are really bread and butter for multiple myeloma, because every myeloma patient will be exposed to these two drugs in the front line. Right? So even for many countries in the world, Asia for instance, in Mongolia, the Kazakhstan, Myanmar, Laos, you do not have Velcade, you do not have Revlimid actually. These patients are still relying on conventional chemotherapy. And North Korea, for instance, no Velcade, no lenalidomide, no Revlimid. So this could have been a Nobel Peace Prize worthy moment coming out of Singapore American drug in exchange for denuclearization, but it wasn't meant to be, unfortunately. They have other agenda. But one major advancement, another major advance in treatment of myeloma is our ability to measure the amount of disease that a patient has. For a long time, we were always contended, we were resting on our laurels when a patient has complete remission, that means CR. So I'm quite sure your doctor will come to you and say, hey, your piece of paper says M-band 0. Congratulations, you are in a CR. So we all feel happy. But then with technology, right now, immunophenotyping, flow cytometry, next generation sequencing, these and PET scan, these are expensive technologies. To be honest, we are able to measure deeper responses. That means if you still have minute amounts of diseases, we can measure. So long as we can measure these amounts, these minute amounts of diseases, we want to be more ambitious here. We want to eradicate more myeloma cells. So as a result, this is a vicious cycle. The more we can measure, or the more sensitive the technology is, the more we want to eradicate the disease. And as a result, this is a vicious cycle that the cost of myeloma will just get higher and higher. This is inevitable. So if you look at the US statistics, you look at inflation in healthcare, US GDP, probably about 200%. But for cancer medical, this involves diagnostics, the inflation is about 600%. But if you look at cancer drug cost, the inflation is almost 1,000%. So this is indeed very, very remarkable. And all of us blame the US for why your Velcade, your Revlimid, your Carfilzomib, everything is so expensive, because these are originally developed in the US, because you have to think about the high costs involved in research and development, because no drugs will just come like that. You need to go through many phases of testing. And unfortunately, in the UK, it's got to do with Obamacare. The Medicare cannot negotiate for drug prices. So the pharmaceutical giants would dictate the prices in America, and in America, most patients are all well insured. And unfortunately, these prices get transmitted down to the rest of the world. So why your Velcade is so expensive, why your Carfil is so expensive, is because the prices is pegged to the prices in the US. And also the reimbursement system in the US encourages more expensive options. There's always a middle person where you get a cut, and then this inflates the cost even more. And US, although all drugs have got a patent, there are always means to evergreen a patent, such that these patents become longer and longer, and this does not allow the generics to come in. So that's why this explains why the cost of these myeloma drugs are so expensive. So take, for instance, over the past 10, 20 years or so, these are the cancer drugs that are being approved by the FDA in the US. So in the year 2004, a magic bullet called Gleevec, which is a drug for a disease called chronic myeloid leukemia. If you've got this disease, your survivor is 4 to 5 years. But if you can lay hands on this drug, your life expectancy is no different from the healthy population. So when this drug was approved, it was about $4,000 or $5,000. Right now, as the year goes, with every approval, the drugs are getting more and more expensive. So this cluster represents all the myeloma drugs that were approved probably about 4 or 5 years ago: Carfilzomib, pomalidomide, Ixazomib, Daratumumab. Right now, these approved drugs, they are averaging at about $15,000 to $20,000 a month. So this inflation is indeed quite scary for many of us. So last year we had Asia Myeloma Network meeting in Beijing. We look at the member countries in Asia and see how these new drugs are available in these respective countries. So, well, if you have myeloma, the best place to be is in Japan, because it's all paid by the state. They have a national healthcare system, and all these expensive drugs are reimbursed. But in Singapore, I mean, to a large extent, whenever a drug is first introduced, most patients may still have to self-pay or rely on their insurance. So there isn't a perfect system in most parts of Asia. So doctors are actually working very hard behind the scene if you're a patient in a restructured hospital, because we are working with the authorities, MAF, trying to bring these drugs, make these drugs available to patients who need it. So there is a dire need to reduce the price of drugs. This is a global problem. It's as bad as global warming, and we need to do something about it. So of course, the health authority need to do something. Health authorities need to negotiate for drug prices and control the formulary. However, with every negotiation, the risk is that the drug gets introduced later and later. This is unfortunate. And the health authority must facilitate earlier entry of generics or biosimilars, because generics are cost only a fraction of what you would expect to pay for, compared to the original drug. So it's been shown that with more generic companies coming in, actually the cost of a certain drug would definitely come down. So for now, Velcade, Revlimid, the patents are still on in Singapore, but this differs for different countries. So of course, as doctors, we would always want these drugs, the prices of these drugs, to be lower and lower, so that this will ease the burden of our patients. And our pharmaceutical partners, yes, they play a very important role, because without these drugs, many of our myeloma patients will not be alive today. However, I mean, it would be good that if they can lower drug costs and also the cost of drug development, there ought to be some transparency with research and development, so that if we know that company A spends certain amount of money on research and selling this drug at this profit margin, I mean, we'll be at least more reassured that the company is helping us sell this drug and making this drug available to our patients. And also, we're always looking forward to value-based pricing. That means the patient pays only if the drug works. If the drug doesn't work, the patient doesn't have to pay. But unfortunately, this only applies to the CAR-T for leukemia children. But most for adult patients, unfortunately, we don't have this kind of system, value-based pricing, where you pay only if the drug works. So for doctors, especially for myeloma key opinion leaders, we have a responsibility to improve treatment guidelines. If we blindly follow Western guidelines, we will bankrupt the patient, we will bankrupt the healthcare system. So also education is very important. So it is our role to educate the patient why they need to be adherent to certain protocols or regimens. Otherwise, I mean, the cost of relapse may actually be more expensive than the cost of the frontline treatment. Clinical trial is also a very important way for us to reduce drug expenditure, the cost of treatment for our patients. So our Asia Myeloma group has actually come out with our own guidelines based on resource availability. This is for Asian perspective, which is a little bit more down to earth and more practical in the Asia setting. So recently we have an update, a revision of this guideline for Asian physicians. And in this guideline, we are trying to paint a picture that although there are advances, sometimes we don't always have to go for the Rolls Royce or the Ferraris. Sometimes Toyota may do just a good job. And also in this review, we engage doctors, key opinion leaders from India. Why India? Is because if you look at drug costs, for instance, in Velcade or Potazumib, this green bar represents American cost for Velcade, whereas India is here, I mean, probably like $100-200. Similarly for lenalidomide, American price is $10,000 US, but for India it's again a few $100. So this is important, especially since the patent for Potazumib and for lenalidomide are coming to the tail end. And these drugs are very important, so that we want these drugs to be combined with other drugs as well. So very important for us to know how to bring these prices down. So how about clinical trial? You've heard a lot from Prof. Chung earlier on. Will clinical trial benefit us? Certainly. So all the drugs that you have heard, all the novel drugs, by the time they move from bench to bedside, it will take at least 5 to 10 years. But patients are dying. So sometimes the best way to gain access to a certain drug is to enroll into a clinical trial. And the good thing is that in a clinical trial, the drugs are free. There's no free lunch in the world, but sometimes I tell patients that if clinical trial, everything is free, and so that is good. On the other hand, as doctors, we are always mindful that in the clinical trial, it is always a learning curve. Sometimes when we're dealing with new drugs, we are faced with unexpected side effects. For instance, like 1 week ago, FDA issued a warning on the drug called venetoclax in multiple myeloma. We were very optimistic that this drug could benefit a subgroup of patients with multiple myeloma. It came as a surprise to me that, hey, this was associated with higher toxicities. But whatever it is, I mean, as doctors, we are always keeping abreast with the latest in development so that we know the risks involved with clinical trials, with every single drug out there, so that whenever there are hints or signs that a certain drug may not be safe, we will always discuss with the patients. So in a nutshell, how we approach myeloma in this current era is that when a patient is diagnosed with myeloma, unfortunately, we always need to look at the reimbursement, because myeloma is not just a one-time treatment. We're looking at the whole career, the whole is longitudinal, so that we know where to disperse funds when needed. So with modern day diagnostics, the doctor will decide what's the best way to treat a patient, whether the patient needs conventional chemo, transplant, novel drugs, whether clinical trial would be ideal for the patient, and in the tail end, if the patient needs CAR-T, then we will need to see which are the centers that are doing CAR-T and refer patients. And also, of course, at the back end, sometimes if a patient desperately needs generics, then there are actually resources for that. So whatever it is, I mean, in Singapore, no one should be denied of effective treatment to achieve the best outcomes. There are always ways to go around. So for a doctor, we are essentially your lobang king, so to speak. So lastly, do not underestimate the power of the patient. Right? So patient care organizations are very, very important. Patient support and education is very, very important. So I'm always inspired by this movie called Dying to Survive. Has anyone seen this movie? This is actually the summer blockbuster in China last year. So it loosely depicts a real-life story of a man called Lu Yong. He was a drugstore owner. He was down with chronic myeloid leukemia. That's the disease which I mentioned. If you have access to a pill, you survive indefinitely. If you do not, you survive 4 to 5 years. So at that time when he had the disease, he could not afford the original drug called Gleevec, which costs about $4,000 a month, and you have to take it forever. So he turned to India and obtained generics. In the process, because he was a drugstore keeper, so in the process he imported Gleevec for 1,000 other Chinese patients. And when the authorities found out, he was jailed for bringing in counterfeit drugs. But then again, this led to a petition, and eventually he was acquitted, he was released. And to us, I mean, he's not a criminal, but he's more like a folk hero because he's saved 1,000 other patients. So right now, because of this story, which is actually a real story, it has resulted in the Chinese government loosening up their grip on drug control. So right now, they're easing the availability of generic drugs because we need to save lives after all. So there is a fine balance to be achieved between respecting patents and intellectual property, because our industry partners pump in a lot of money to do research to improve survival of patients. We have to respect that, and charging a premium for certain drug, I mean, that is to be expected. On the other hand, we need to balance that with respecting lives. So this is represented by India, where in 1970 the India Patency Act did away with patents, such that in India you can produce generic drugs. As a result, the generic drugs are so cheap. I mean, many of us will know that many patients will go to India to buy generic drugs because it costs just a fraction of what you would expect in most the rest of the world. So a balance has to be struck somewhere in between. And also I want to take this opportunity to highlight the importance of patient advocacy. So recently there was a study called Make Blood Cancer Visible. This was a project done in Asia to really gather information on the public's perception of what blood cancer is. As you know, myeloma is a rare disease, it's a blood cancer, it's a very rare blood cancer. So if you were to speak to your friends or relatives, sometimes they will probably ask you, hey, what is myeloma? And there's a lot of misconception. I mean, linking blood cancer to death is something incurable. It could be contagious. And whether you're in Japan, you're in China, there's a lot of misconceptions about what blood cancer is. And in developing countries, as a result of this misconception or unawareness of what blood cancers are, this led to very late diagnosis for many patients with multiple myeloma with detrimental outcomes. So it is very, very important for the public to know what blood cancer is, what multiple myeloma is, and also for the patients, it's also very, very important for patients to know that you are not alone. So something like this is very useful because it gathers all myeloma patients in one single room. You know you're not alone. There are also other multiple myeloma sufferers like you. So by having unity or strength, we could actually do a lot. So recently, this is a study done by an NGO called Rare Cancers Australia. So as you know, Australia, being a typical Western country, their patient support organizations are very strong. They know what to do, how to grill the government. So they surveyed the various patient support organizations in Asia and look at how they go about doing the things. So, I mean, in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize that. What they found is that most patient support group in Asia is more like a social gathering. Patient support group does not engage the government, does not engage the industry or the pharma companies. But these are very important because whereas in Australia, in the Western societies, the patient support groups are typically very vocal, right? So they know how to engage the government, the industry, and this is very important because right now we're facing a crisis. The treatment of myeloma, the drug costs associated with treatment of myeloma is indeed a crisis, and we need all stakeholders to come in to make treatment feasible for all with multiple myeloma. So education is important, and we actually need to identify patient champions and leaders and motivated family members to actually champion programs in a patient support group, and not just like education event like this. Actually, we can move beyond just a gathering like this, and also regional meetings for best practice sharing. So as a matter of fact, this year in October, in conjunction with the Asia Myeloma Network, I'm involved with Asia Myeloma Patient Support Group Forum. So actually, I would invite many of you to attend. In fact, we want to send Singapore patients to this meeting to interact with patients from other countries in Asia, so that together you can learn from one another and see how everyone engages the industry, the pharmaceutical companies. So in essence, as doctors, there's so much we can do. We empower you, patients, with knowledge, with education. We teach you about clinical trials, how best to deal with myeloma. However, with this empowerment, I mean, we always want patients to be proactive, to engage the industry, to engage healthcare authority, because we have a common problem, common agenda is to reduce the price of myeloma treatment so that myeloma treatment will be available to all in time to come. So to summarize, prognosis of myeloma has improved significantly. The key to improve survival outcomes is actually the access to the latest novel therapeutics. Regional collaboration is important to optimize patient outcomes. Escalation of costs involved in myeloma care may not be sustainable for many healthcare systems. As it is, I think if MOH looks at the healthcare bill size of a typical myeloma patient, MOH will really freak out because it's definitely not cheap. Engaging various stakeholders is key to finding solutions for affordability and access. So before I end, I just want to share with you a quotation. With access to treatment, a patient is able to live now. With access to support and education, a patient is able to live well. And with capability building, a patient is able to live for the future. Thank you very much.